presentations as part of the challenging debates on disability and reproductive justice, and we are now going to look at the topic of forced sterilisation. An issue in Ireland which I am constantly told doesn't happen, but that's our argument back is that because we don't have any data on it. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing the perspectives of our presenters today. I'm joined by Andrea, Natalia and Magdalena. We are going to run a tight ship. I am going to try and run a tight ship, and other people will help me do so in terms of timings, so that we can have discussion and have a better understanding of the topic. So first of all, I am going to ask Andrea Parra to begin, who, as you probably are aware, is Director of Advocacy with CREA. And Andrea, if you want to start.
Yeah, great. You've seen me all the morning. So maybe, Buzz, you have gathered by now. I don't like lecturing. So I thought I would ask you some things. So first, I'm going to ask you if you can talk to a person close to you, or one or two persons, about what are messages that you got as a child about having kids. So you have 2 minutes. Go. ¿Me los escribes? ¿Papel? Okay, if you can wrap up. And I'm going to ask you to shout, what are some of those things that you kind of received as a young person? What are some of those messages? So shout them and I'll repeat them. Sorry?
Be married.
Be married. To have kids, you have to be married. Okay? Others? Kids are? Expected. A blessing? Did someone get that one? Kids are blessing.
Because I want grandkids.
I don't know, I can't repeat that in Irish. But say it again.
Have babies because mama wants grandkids.
Mama wants grandkids, so have kids because of that. Others?
Asking if I would be able to have children at all.
Okay, so asking, is she, yeah. So then for people who experience disability, will she be able to have kids? And was that a bad thing or a good thing?
I was like 9 years old, so it was something I wasn't thinking about.
But for them, it was a concerning question. Oh, she might not be able to have kids. Okay. Other things?
Follow your dream.
Follow your dream by having kids. Okay. Other things?
Don't be too old when you have them.
Don't have them too old. Yeah, that's right. Don't have them too young. Other things? Don't have too many. Don't have none. Yeah, so have kids. Is your destiny? Did someone get that one? Like you have to be a mother? It's expected, so. Anything else?
Or because you have a disability is not even a topic they talk to you about.
So not even talked about for some of the people in the audience. Okay, so
Know your rights.
know your rights
Know your rights.
as a parent,
Yeah.
as a future parent. Is that what they told you when you were a child?
As a child, we all need to know our rights.
So now I'm going to ask you to talk to the same people. What are some messages that you received as a young person about sexuality? Sexuality. Yes. So talk with a person close to you for a couple of minutes. ¿Anotaste? Yeah, okay, cool.
I'm just getting the next presentation.
Natalia's, yeah.
So,
Yeah, that one.
yeah?
Yeah. All right, let's wrap up and let's hear some. So what are some of the messages that you received as a young person about sexuality? Don't mention it. It's taboo. It doesn't exist. Okay, what other things? It's for later. You're not mature enough to understand that. So when was later? So after 16. Okay, that's pretty young for my corner of the world. Don't let a boy touch you, you get pregnant. Sorry? Sorry? Especially if you hold hands, you'll get pregnant. Yeah, others? Shout them. Yeah. Okay, so boys don't get talked about. And in my culture, girls had to protect their virginity. But it was totally okay for men to lose it very quickly. Yeah. Back there? Right, so the way you dress says how easy, how difficult you are. In Colombia, there's a saying that there are women for wives and women for sex, very different appearance. And someone had another hand? What else? What else came up?
That the man's pleasure is important in sex, not the woman's.
Men's pleasure is important in sex, not women's. Yeah? At least there was some conversation about pleasure in that one. Something else?
If she says yes. No, if she says no, she means yes.
No means yes. And yes, she's too easy. Right. Sergio?
From my experience and friend's experience, like the main idea for us was use protection. And everything else was like implied or was important. So the concept was use protection.
And use protection because you can get pregnant, or use protection because you can get HIV?
I would say at first the idea was without discrimination. After it's like to I don't know.
Don't get any woman pregnant.
Yeah, but there's nothing after that sentence.
Okay, just use protection. Another question is, so was always the assumption that sex was heterosexual? Yes. Absolutely. From a small girl. Oh, do you have a boyfriend in kindergarten? Yes, Ana Lucia. Yes? It was sinful, yes. If you think about it too much, you might get pregnant, like Virgin Mary. She wasn't thinking about it too much. I didn't say that.
child that says sex was the best thing ever.
Excellent. Someone with a good experience in this whole auditorium. 1 out of, I don't know. So anything else? Yeah.
Maybe I can add something else. I heard someone say that you cannot keep before marriage, but they are also saying that you cannot have any sex beyond marriage.
Right. So sex is only when you've made a decision and you've met someone special with whom you're going to spend the rest of your life. Okay, so that's an interesting, and I have Natalia writing that list. But now I want to ask in the big group, what are messages that we receive about people with disabilities having children? What doesn't happen? So people with disabilities don't have children. They're children themselves, so how can they have children? So it's an infantilization throughout their life cycle. What are other things?
You're going to make broken babies.
Broken babies, so yes.
They're going to love you if you have them.
Yeah, so there are two things in that. One is that you will bring more people with disabilities to the world. And the other is you will be a bad parent because they will not love you because you can't be a parent. Yeah? Is that what you were referring to?
Yes, but no man's ever going to love you because you're disabled.
Okay, so if you have, so generally, then that's linked to if you have a child, it's because you were raped.
Or somebody tricked you.
Or somebody tricked you. Well, seduced you superstitiously, something.
Also, often it's okay for a man to be disabled to have the woman to look after him, but vice versa is kind of
Right. So if it's a man with a disability, it's okay for the woman to take care of her. But if it's a woman with a disability, then the man who marries her is a hero. Or
two gay people who have a disability want to have a child. That's easy.
oh yeah, that is like in Mars. 2 gay people with disabilities having kids. Okay. What else? What other representations do we have?
That it would be a burden on the grandparents.
It would be a burden on the grandparents. So ethics of care. If a person with a disability, this I've heard a lot about people with intellectual disabilities. If a person with a intellectual disability has a child, then it's the grandmother who will raise them.
Or the child will be taken to care.
Sorry?
The child will be taken to care.
Or they will be placed in protective care. Protective in quotes. Yes?
If someone decides to live with a disabled woman, that person has to be really inferior to her, because otherwise there is like no point for. So to say, for example, men who's equal to her to like live with her or marry her, especially.
Right. So again, same. If a man chooses to have a woman with a disability with a partner, is because he is emasculated or a very good person or someone who doesn't have any self-esteem.
Didn't manage to get non-disabled women.
They didn't manage to get a non-disabled woman. So the question of desirability is key. Someone else back there was going to say something.
So in the state of Queensland in Australia, it is a criminal act to have sex with a person with intellectual disability.
Yeah, so actually it's common in several legal systems that any kind of sexual interaction with a person with an intellectual disability is presumed to be forced. So that the flip side of that is that people with intellectual disabilities cannot consent to sexual relations. Okay?
So also the poor child who has disabled parents, the child, how can you be so selfish to have a child? Do you not think of the child? It will be
Right.
embarrassed about you or, whatever. Like,
Yeah, so the poor child who has parents with disabilities is a selfish act. Okay, so let me just, thank you, Nati. I'm just gonna read this list. Some of the things is like to have kids, you have to be married, kids are expected, kids are blessing, having babies because your parents want grandkids. Will you be able to have kids? Follow your dreams to have kids, don't have them too young, too old. too soon, too late, not even talk about it. Sexuality is for later. Don't let a boy touch you because you get pregnant. It's okay to lose virginity for men, but not for girls. Man's pleasure is more important than women's. No means yes. Yes is too easy. Use protection. Sex is heterosexual. Don't think about it too much. It's the best experience ever. Don't have kids before marriage. People with disabilities shouldn't have children. They are children themselves. They will have broken babies. They will bring people with disabilities to the world. No man is ever going to love you. If you are pregnant, it's because you were raped. It's okay for men with a disability to have a woman to take care of him, but not vice versa. It's a burden on grandparents. The child will be taken to protective care. They didn't manage to get a non-disabled woman. It's a felony to have sex with people with disabilities, and it's selfish to have kids for parents with disabilities. What does this list make you think of? Fear. What? Hey, what did you say?
It makes sex sound really scary.
Yeah, sex is very scary. It's a taboo. So what do all these messages have to do with sterilization? Sterilization is a way to respond to all these fears. Yeah?
No, just to address the issue of children.
Well, that's what the procedure does, right? The procedure makes you physically unable to get pregnant, and it's surgical. But how is sterilization linked to all this list?
Well, it reminds me of practices during Nazi Germany.
Sorry?
It reminds me of practices, during Nazi Germany and before even, like eugenics and...
Yeah, definitely. And Natalia will address a lot of the history and how eugenics influences our way of thinking. And I think that even though eugenics is a bad word today, the legacy is still very present in the way we address the situation and lives of people with disabilities. So one of the issues... So one of the issues with sterilization is how states allow it and how systems relate to sterilization. In my professional life, most of what I've done is provide legal services, and a big chunk of that part to people with disabilities. And many times, women and then parents came to our office to ask, attorney, can you tell me what do I need to do to have my child sterilized? And I'm like, oh, so why do you want to have them sterilized? Oh, because the doctor told me that these children are raped. This was in Colombia. And then when you ask the further question, so how do you think that sterilization will help with that? Then they start questioning. But what I learned throughout these years is that families and parents get sent their lives as parents of children with disabilities get medicalized so early on that the authoritative voices are always influencing and telling them, do this, do that, do this, do that, unquestioned. And it's hard for parents to start questioning the medical system when they just have a newborn with a disability, right? So then these messages of like, you have to sterilize your kid have this weight that has as a background all the history of medicalization that parents have experienced. And these stereotypes deeply influence the way legal systems also understand sterilization. And I just want to make a few points to then pass the mic to my co-panelists. One is that the question of legal capacity is core to the way sterilization is being performed around the world. Because legal guardians are allowed to consent to the medical procedure of sterilization, legal systems don't understand sterilization of a person who is placed under guardianship as violence or as gender-based violence. And sterilization is performed on women with disabilities at much higher numbers than on men with disabilities. And what this means, what does it mean that a legal system doesn't understand this form of sterilization as violence, is that none of the systems that respond to violence are activated in a country, right? So many other groups that are marginalized experience forced sterilization, like indigenous women, people living with HIV, people in prison, trans people. They experience forced sterilization. But our legal systems recognize that as a human rights violation. So people, Roma people, for example, are also, and those are famous cases in Europe of forced sterilization. So people with disabilities are not the only ones who experience forced sterilization, but are the only ones that live in legal systems that legitimize forced sterilization through guardianship. Yes, because legal capacity is withdrawn. That means that we have no data, as Susie mentioned. We don't have any data about forced sterilization of people with disabilities, and it's extremely hard to access. So even with requests for information, generally epidemic statistics are there in countries, so healthcare providers have to report how many procedures of sterilization, of surgical sterilization they have conducted. But what we don't know is how many of those are performed on people who are placed under guardianship, who consented to them. So it's very hard to get the information about how is it happening. And more, and I think probably in every concluding observation that the CRPD committee has done, there are recommendations against forced sterilization, and Article 23 of the Convention actually explicitly states the right to maintain fertility, because it's a recognition of the historic, pervasive, generalized practice of forced sterilization of people with disabilities through the Eugenics Movement and so on. I just wanted to say also that give us a little example. In Colombia, I mentioned it in the previous session. We joined forces with, so we were a legal clinic, and we joined forces with Pro Familia, which is the largest sexual reproductive healthcare provider, service provider in Colombia, with the association of, with Us Down, which is the association of people with intellectual disabilities and their families, and with the Autism League, which is also a member of the node of people with psychosocial disabilities in Colombia, to do a project that is now in its 5th year, to provide sex education to young people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities as part of the larger sex education program that Pro Familia had, and to do focus groups and some legal advocacy around sterilization. And I also want to say what are some of the strategic considerations that we had. One is that as a feminist and as a person who has been learning about both the women's rights movement and the disability rights movement for several years, the question of how these movements dialogue with each other is key. And our assessment was that starting with abortion was the wrong place to start because of how contentious it is, as we saw in the previous session. But sterilization is an issue that women's rights groups wouldn't necessarily oppose, although I've heard like long-standing women's rights activists saying, Andrea, I'm sorry, but there are some people that should be sterilized. And this is a common belief. I mean, some people have the face to say it to your face, but it is a common belief. And so that is a strategy consideration. The other is that it was a way to also start bringing down to earth what are the consequences of having a system that incapacitates people. So that was also a question on the Article 12. We are in a civil law tradition from Roman law, and actually the changes in guardianship from Roman law to today are not that big. And civil law practitioners, this is like the sacred pillar in civil law, personhood, right? And legal capacity is like one of the core comments. So understanding what are the human rights implications of the way the legal capacity framework works now in civil law countries, it's hard, and it's hard to shift. So talking about sterilization was a way to illustrate it in a very powerful way. And I think one outstanding question that we have that has started to happen with regards to other groups is the question of reparations. What happens? How do we identify people with disabilities who have been sterilized? We knew of several cases where families didn't even tell them what procedure they had. It's other people who find out about it, that they were sterilized as a child. We found schools that say, we won't accept your kid into the school if you don't sterilize them. And also what is very tricky is that the request for sterilization is done by the parents because they are the guardians. So what you don't want to do as a human rights practitioner is to go against the families as the human rights violators because the relationship of dependency that exists, because they are also in a system that oppresses them and doesn't give them any support or resources for parenting children with disabilities. Not in all cases, and there's plenty of abuse and violence by family members. But as an overall strategy to portray the parents as the human rights violators, it's problematic or has a lot of tricky questions. So then the question of what is the state's responsibility with regards to sterilization and understanding of sterilization as a procedure that needs to be consented to, and what is consent? All those are questions that we are still wrestling with. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andrea, for that. And the animation is appreciated, getting us all a thinking. We're going to now move on to Natalia Guerrero, who's going to speak further to the issue and your experience and your work. Yes? Yeah, great.
Oh, can I use this?
You're going to need to be there, Andy?
But I hate to be here.
Okay, how are you going to move the slides along?
Being creative, like.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, me las más.
Hi, I know this is a difficult hour of the day, so I'll try to be dynamic and quick. So my name is Natalia, as you know. I'm a lawyer, I'm a legal activist in Colombia. I'm gonna present you a little bit of my master thesis work that I did on sterilization procedures in Canada, the United States, and Colombia. In the real life, I work in a health facility, and I'm also obsessed with practice and how we can make supported decision-making a real thing. But I'm not going to talk about what I do in my real life, but what I did in this thesis. So I think to understand what we're facing right now when it comes to sterilization, we have to understand history. And I think history is a strategic tool to understand where are we and what are we facing right now, and what do we have to deal in the legal perspective. So to understand sterilization, we have to go to the concept of the medical discourse, and specifically the medical discourse that has been used around disability. So when we talk about the medical discourse and disability, we always think about how it is neutral, how it is objective, because science is objective. That's what they told us, and that's what we in our imaginaries have. We know that medical language it comes from a rational method, so it is the truth. That's what we know and understand. Next. So this rhetoric that is embodied in the medical language is what makes us think medicine is always objective. But I'm going to show you a few examples of how during the 1920s, 1930s, these medical theories were used as a way to mask all the moral, racial, social, economical anxieties that societies were facing at the moment. So I also want to question how the law uses medicine and how the law has used medicine in sterilization debates as if it was objective. Next, I'm showing a picture that says some people are a burden for the others, which was a popular publicity during the 1920s. Next. So my claim is it is necessary to contextualize and to look what is behind the medical discourse and what is behind all those medical concepts and categories that we still have present today, and how this concept, the concept of disability, has been traditionally linked to political, economical, racial, and moral agendas and anxieties. So I'm gonna, this is a phrase that I like of Stephen Gould, and it says, objectivity is the myth of science. So I have a few examples to show you how this works. The first one is biological determinism, which was very popular during the first decades of the 20th century. And in Latin America, we saw it related with climate and weather. So it was popular to say that people of those weathers, of those tropical weathers, were inferior. They were never going to progress because of the weather. That is an example of how biological determinism works. The other thing, and maybe you may know this theory of the moment, is cryometry, which was a scientific theory that was used to say that some people's brains were bigger than others people. And that was a way to justify that some races and also some genders were superior than others. And the other one that is sadly being still used today is the IQ, the famous IQ theory. Next. So I'm showing two pictures. One picture is it was what we know as the Binet scale at the moment. This is the 1920s studies. And what Binet led us as his legacy was these categories of the moment, who argued that they were different kinds of scales of feeble-minded people. That was the category at the moment. We have the imbeciles, we have the idiots, and then somebody made up this category of morons. And those categories that were supposed to be scientific then become the law, and then become the argument to justify sterilization procedures. So the Binet scale after became the IQ. So when we talk about the IQ today, we have to understand where does it come from. And it comes from that horrific scale that Binet once created. So these are other examples of how science have justified divisions based on gender, race, and social origin. So I have one example in the US that was called the Project Headstart, and the scientific community of the moment argued that it was a project to put people from vulnerable conditions into schools. And the scientifics of the moment were argued that people from poor neighborhoods would never be intelligent because their IQ was lower. So they were basically telling the government, don't waste your money on that people because they will never learn. The other example I have is how IQ categories were used to support immigration acts at the moment. So we have a lot of examples in the United States where scientific communities were arguing that all immigrants were less intelligent, and they were measuring their IQ and saying, we cannot receive these people in our country because they're less intelligent. The other example is that when someone said in 1916 that all criminals were feeble-minded, and all feeble-minded people were potential criminals. So this sounds like a joke, but this really happened, and these were the laws. This is an image of how cryometry people measure brains, and of course, the standard was the Greek man's brain, and they argued that Afro-descendant women, Mongolian, they all had smaller brains, so they were less intelligent. There was also a claim about how sex workers were all less intelligent or feeble-minded. And I can tell you like multiple examples of how science has been using history to justify differences. Next. So why do I like give you these examples? Because this is crucial to understand what was the eugenic movement. And the eugenic movement, I know you might know, it was a theory during the first decades of the 20th century that justified that we needed to improve race because that was going to bring us progress, specifically during the Great Depression. This was after the Great Depression in the 1929. And the core of the eugenics movements was to understand that some people could be good in birth and that we as a society have to work through positive and negative measures to only allow good people, fit people to be born. And I'm going to show you an example of positive eugenics. Well, borning better babies, that was the obsession at the moment, how we can like birth better babies. Next. And this is an example of a positive, they call it like that. It's not that it's positive. I don't think this is positive. It was called the Eugenic certificate. So when you were going to marry, you go to a doctor and they told you, this guarantees that I have examined the gender of the sender of this card and find a perfect physical and mental balance and usually a strong eugenic love possibilities well fitted to promote the happiness and future welfare of the race. So this is an example of how the state pushed people to like be involved with other fit people and avoid unfit people. Next. And the negative, as they call it, measure by excellence during eugenics time was sterilization. So these are the roots of the sterilization procedures that we are still seeing today. Sterilization was conceived as a protective measure. It was a preventive measure to avoid more unfit babies to be born. It is funny when throughout this seminar I've heard a lot about this concept of the best interest of the child, the best interest of the patient, and this is not new. This was used by eugenics. So this discourse was also present there, the best interest of the patients. I studied very closely the cases of the US and Canada, and what we saw is that you may imagine that this was forced and they like touch you to like a place and they force you. And they did have a lot of procedures. They have a superintendent to recommend the sterilization. Then they have a eugenics board that study the case. And in many cases, they ask the family and the person with disabilities for the sterilization procedures. So of course it was forced, but they had all these procedures like in a organized way. Next. So a little bit about the example of the United States. I think this is the most emblematic example. It's the state where more people were sterilized by the state in a compulsory measures. We have this emblematic case of the Somona State Home in California, where many people were sterilized. When you review the actual documents of the time, you can see that the argument for women that were labeled as women with disabilities were sterilized is that they had sexual delinquency. And in the cases of men, the argument was therapeutic reasons. So you can also see like a difference there. And the other thing that is curious is that by the 1960s, the last Sterilization Act was overruled on 1973. So it's not like far away, it's recent. The 60% of those people who have been sterilized were black and 99% were female. This is the US case. And what is going on? Oh, well, this is an emblematic case also, and I think it should be analyzed, and it's the case of the Supreme Court of the United States that then allowed many states to enact legal frames on sterilization. And this was basically the story about Carrie, her mother, and her newborn. And the three of them were labeled as imbeciles at the moment. So the Supreme Court says, oh yes, we have to sterilize Carrie because 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So this was like an emblematic case that then pushed a lot of courts in different parts of the world to do the same. So what's going on right now in the US? What have they done with this legacy? And reviewing the internal law frame, right now, the Supreme Court hasn't, until 2015-16, when I did my thesis, I don't know if something happened after that, the Supreme Court hasn't referred to sterilization on people with disabilities again, since Buck v. Bell, so since 1927. They have made some statements on sterilization of inmates, of migrants, but not on people with disabilities. And it varies from state to state. In some states, sterilization ordered or decided by guardians is still allowed under the argument of the best interest of the child, which is really popular. Next. Canada. Canada is an excellent case of a study because they have also a strong history on eugenics, which, curious enough, the eugenic measures in Canada were pushed by women's organizations at the moment. The most popular legislation there was the Alberta and British Columbia legislations. And the arguments they were using was sex hygiene and that unfit people were creating race genocide. Next. What we also saw in the Canadian case was how many Aboriginal peoples, women especially, were sterilized, arguing that they were feeble-minded, the category of the moment. And of course, this after that created a big concern in terms of race. And I want to highlight how did Canada fix the sterilization concerns at the moment. In 1986, the Canadian Supreme Court studied a case of the typical case we see in Colombia every day, a woman with an intellectual disability, and her mother was asking for a sterilization procedure because hygiene duties were getting too hard for her. And the Supreme Court said, we have a strong history with eugenics and we cannot allow our state to do this again. So if the person cannot give consent, then the person cannot be sterilized. Case closed. Well, it was not that simple, but you should review the judicial sentence. And as Andrea said, now Canada is facing a lot of reparations discussions. There's this famous case about Leland Moore, who was a woman that unfortunately she died on 2016, but she became an advocate for the cause of forced sterilization, and she was sterilized in Alberta when she was a young girl without her knowledge, and then she found out when she wanted to have kids in her 30s. So the reparation the Alberta court gave to Leanne became like a really important frame in this topic. And finally, Colombia. This is an strategic and interesting case of a study. We also, of course, had the eugenics legacy, but in Colombia, the eugenic legacy became another thing because we had other anxieties, and our basic anxiety at the moment was race, and how our government thought that indigenous people, Afro-descendant people, were gonna avoid us to have progress. So the Eugenic Movement in Colombia became what we know now as the whitening program. So we were we were encouraging Europeans to go to our country so we can whiten our country. Of course, in the migration acts of the moment, people with disability were banned from entering our country, but we were giving land to Europeans in order to make our race better. In Colombia history, you cannot find any reference to an sterilization act being discussed. There is a reference in the Red Cross magazine of the moment where they discuss how Colombia should be doing this, but we didn't have the infrastructure, the health system was in charge of the church, so there was no discussion. But what is happening now, and the current situation in Colombia, is that, as Andrea explained, we let sterilization procedures to be part of a judicial decision under the guardian's petition. So what we had until last year is that with a guardianship sentence and with a judicial approval, any guardian can ask their children or their daughters or siblings to be sterilized. And no one asks the person. Like, as a health provider, you will see the person like when you were gonna do the procedure. Never, there was no asking the person. So I have 3 quick cases that I would like to share with you. These 3 cases are real. I'm gonna start with the first one, that is a judicial decision from 2016, and the judge is arguing she's talking about an 11-year-old boy with a cognitive disability, and look what she says. He has a poor reproductive diagnosis, so he can be a good candidate for a definite sterilization process for the benefit of him, the family, and society. This sounds like 1927, but it's 2016. This is still going on. The second case is the typical case we see. A mother is explaining her situation with her young kid, Manuela, and she's arguing the court that she needs to sterilize her children because she's a single mother and she needs to go to work every day and she has to leave Manuela locked up in her house. And boys are chasing her. So it's the basic argument that we see every day. Sterilization is going to prevent sexual violence. And it's going to prevent that there is a kid locked up in a house. And the third case, which is also really typical, a father asking for the sterilization of a young girl, arguing that men are chasing her because she's very beautiful. That's actually an argument he makes. And they can abuse her and give her STDs, as sterilization was going to prevent that. So in 2016, we had a case that changed the history of this topic. And it's the case of a 16-year-old girl with Down syndrome from a rural area in Colombia. Her mother took her to the health facility, and the first thing that the doctor asked her was, "Have you already sterilized your girl?" It's like an automatic assumption. She has a disability, so have you already sterilized your daughter? And they make you feel unresponsible if you hadn't. So this case basically changed everything because the state recognized that no one has asked the girl, whose name is Silvia, if she wanted to get the procedure. And basically that became a discrimination on basis of on disability and on gender and on age, because this was a little girl, and demanded the Minister of Health to create a protocol to resolve these kinds of violations. So I'm gonna, next. So basically with this I will end. What I wanted to show is that we have 3 discourses that we have seen in history. The eugenics, then you mentioned the Holocaust, and yes, that is an important point, but we have to remember that the sterilization procedures were taking place before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. The thing is that the discourse changed. So after the Holocaust, even the sterilization procedures went up. And the discourse was not, we have to make the race better, but the discourse was, we have to protect these women because they cannot handle motherhood. And they were still doing it. And we have the present discourse, that is what we're seeing now, I think these points are important to understand what we're seeing now. Sterilization to prevent sexual abuse. And this doesn't even have like a rational, it is not like rational to think that, but what we are seeing is that parents actually think that sterilization is going to prevent sexual violence, and we are kind of allowing sexual violence to happen because the rates of sexual violence are still really high. The pursuit of the best interest of the person. And I think in the name of the best interest of the person, there are many abuses have been committed, so I will really not trust this category as we have seen it. To protect single mothers' interests. So some feminists are really concerned about single mothers' interests, and they're just focused on what they want, what they need, and we kind of completely forget about the person with a disability that is in the center of that decision. We keep measuring disabilities, and I think that's something that it's really concerning because that's the legacy of the medical discourse. We keep saying that someone has a severe disability, which from the model social of the disability, this is not a discourse that we should be accepting, and this is usually used by judges. This person has an IQ of, so we should sterilize her. Or we receive cases every day where you see this person has a severe disability, so don't even ask her, she won't understand. Lastly, the obsession with good decisions. As Andrea mentioned, and we have an obsession with good decisions, especially health professionals, when it comes to people with disabilities and children. You are obsessed with them taking good decisions. They are somehow the judges of the good decisions, and we forget that the medical ethic standards ask professionals to guarantee decision-making process. We are not the judges of good decisions, but we see this every day, and this affects a lot of the decision families and persons with disabilities face every day. So I'm gonna end with this too.
Well, I think we're all very much better informed from that presentation anyway, aren't we? In terms of the history of why we are where we are, and as well as the current things that are taking place. So thank you very much, Natalia. I really appreciate that. Finally, today we're going to hear from Magdalena Zarzata, who's coming to us from a perspective of Polish, a sociological perspective, but also in terms of your experience working with women who have disabilities as a woman with a disability as well, and progressing those issues. So over to you.
Okay, hi guys, can you hear me? Okay, so I'm supposedly the last person to speak, so I should really make it quick. Done! Okay, so the title of the presentation, Forced Sterilization. Let me just use the mic otherwise. So what? Okay, let me start. But before I start, let me pause. Why? First of all, I want us to be reminded that we are in a certain context together. So the knowledge that is being shared and produced together here is not neutral. We're coming from different standpoints and backgrounds. So together we are in a room of people who are representing, different cultures, countries, and we are all in some ways members of the civil society. And by that, I mean not only the fact that you might work for an NGO or for some institution, but as citizens, as people, we are members of the civil society. And then all of us met here together for a reason, and that reason is the 10th school, the 10th edition. And I listed down the aims, why you guys met up here and why are we meeting up here. So moving forward, intersectionality, a specific type of intersectionality that is gender, disability, and age, in order to explore creative advocacy from around the world. And the umbrella, the overall umbrella are the human rights and United Nations regime. So that's the context. And then we have the subject of our session, which is forced sterilization. And as Andrea, and I'm sorry, Natalia, we just met, presented, we could see that these are very complex and multi-layered, this is a very complex and multi-layered issue with a long history. And so, as such, there are many entry points to this subject. So there is you, there is the context of the school, there is the topic, and there is me. So what is my entry point to the issue? First of all, I'm centering disabled women's perspectives. You see, aha language. I'm using disabled women consciously, meaning I myself use the identity first language because I'm embedded in the social model perspective from the British tradition. You might hear me use the person first language interchangeably. You might also use terminology related to disability in their historic specificity. Then there is one of the motives how I wanted to enter this subject was to bridge lived experiences and activism, which are usually framed as quote-unquote doing, with academia research, quote-unquote thinking. And my task and my interest is to blur those lines by bringing disabled women as experts. And then when it comes to methodological and theoretical perspective, it's informed mostly by feminist disability studies. And then there is me, meaning my situatedness. You know, I have my priorities, biases, types of discrimination that I experience myself, but also privileges. So yeah, Polish disabled woman with invisible impairments, educated in Anglo-American disability studies, disability activist, human rights educator. That's me. So with all that in the back of your heads, now you might better understand what is the guiding question and why I chose this guiding question to be an entry point to the subject of forced sterilization. So yeah, it is important for me to ask a question: what is known about forced sterilization, or what is not known about forced sterilization? But I'm even more interested in this other set of questions. What does the knowledge about the dominant discourses and practices regarding forced sterilization can tell us about civil society, meaning us, and our approaches to it? What are the gaps in disability activism, and how can those findings inform or reshape our human rights advocacy? So we know the guiding questions. Now, I will remind you who are our guides: the disabled girls and women. So as we already know, and you already know, and we experienced that, lack of data about any subject related to disability is staggering. And what's also staggering is the fact that people, disabled girls and women, who are primary victims of many forms of discriminations, get rarely to speak out. Yeah, we are missing testimonies. That's like the basic thing. But my approach is not only to bring the voices of disabled women and the subject, but also to treat them as theorists. So how do they theorize from their lived experience? In other words, what I will present you today about forced sterilizations is their critique about civil society. And I perceive that critique as being legitimate and valid. It means also that you might engage in an argument with that critique, and that's fine. But first of all, the starting point is that we see those people, see the disabled girls and women as theorists from their lived experience. So, going back to the question that was in the background, what is known? How is forced sterilization approached? Here is, in a nutshell, what we know. So I picked up main tropes of human rights discourses, especially within the United Nations regime. So it's being described as form of violence, infringement of human dignity and physical and mental integrity may constitute torture or cruel or inhuman treatment. And once the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture called it crimes against humanity, when committed as a part of widespread or systemic attack directed against any civilian population. So that's more or less the discourse that is being used to describe and categorize forced sterilization within UN regime. Then what else do we know about forced sterilization? That it's widespread. It's everywhere around the world. We also know that girls and women with disabilities are disproportionately affected by that. And we also know that within that group, the most challenged group are women with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, and, as rarely mentioned, those who are placed in institutions, hidden from our view. And of course, surprise, surprise, no surprise, lack of sufficient data, and my co-panelists already mentioned that. The data is not updated, and it's very hard to access the data. So, okay, on the one hand, we have forced sterilization that is being framed from time to time as crimes against humanity. And on the other hand, we have victims who usually remain hidden from the system, legal systems, from around the world. And those who are recognized as victims, rare cases, as my co-panelist mentioned, even if they're recognized, they often remain without any redress. And perpetrators not held accountable and punished. Do we think about perpetrators often in terms of forced sterilization? Nah. So we have this incredible topic, a grave human rights violation. And what my experts, disabled women, said about how do we as civil society react. One of my respondents said, "Where is the outrage? Why there are no proportionate actions taken by civil society?" So that particular respondent said that for her, the way civil society reacts to forced sterilization is a form of an outrage test, meaning we have this unspeakable crime and almost no outrage. What does it tell us about us as a civil society, and also about underpinning logic that drives our movements? And here is just a very brief mapping of the main tropes that came up from my analysis, from my conversation with disabled women. So I remind you, I treat them as theorists. So one of the very interesting recurring trope was that they think the lack of outrage, it will be like quote unquote, lack of outrage, has to do with the dominance of discourse of progress. And you already also mentioned that we as societies tend to frame our history as in terms of progress, that we are moving forward. Things are getting better. And this discourse masks a lot of ideologies that are actually present. They are still there, but they're masked. As Natalia said, they operate in a more subtle ways or through different narratives. But the underpinning logic might be the same. So a lot of my respondents said, you know what? People tend to say, yeah, eugenics, California, all the history, this, and it's gone. And my respondents say, you know what? I think it might be similar with the rehabilitation. There might be rehabilitative logic. And we can talk about eugenic thinking or eugenic logic that is underpinning things that are going on. Why are we avoiding eugenic as a word, as a terminology, if eugenic logic still prevails? So it seems. And it's validated by medical profession. Another aspect that popped up was ableism that corrodes disability activism and the identity politics being, contributing to separating of different groups of people within disability activism, and the fact that the majority of victims are girls and women with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities might be a red flag. Because a lot of people within our movement might be detaching themselves from the stigma that is attached to intellectual disabilities. Meaning, you know what, I'm not that group. I'm always good with my head, No, it's just the physical. So we have to be very careful about ableism that is creeping our movement. Then there is the intersectional aspect. I mentioned that, it's usually the girls or young women with intellectual disabilities who are institutionalized. So we have intersectionality of age, disability, and social economic status. So we have to look for people who are hidden from our view. Then, rarely spoken, neoliberalism and human rights. Why? Why aren't we talking about neoliberalism and depoliticization of civil society? I have little time, so I'll just speed up. And then another interesting trope, internalized normalization, meaning, okay, if we have progress, then it means that things are more or less all right. So proportionate reactions to grave discrimination in our society framed as radical, and radical is associated with something that's wrong, that's disturbing. So a lot of activists avoid proportionate reactions in order not to be labeled, radical. For sterilization, so what? Yeah, we have to move forward, but how to move forward? How to move forward? Taking into account that the discourse of progress is tricky. So one of the ideas how to move forward without reproducing discourse of progress is reconnect with the origins of the human rights logic and system. So I think that brought us here together. So starting from the very start, let's say, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we all know it, preamble, We tend to forget that disability was at the core of the foundations of human rights system, and that the barbarous acts that are mentioned in the preamble refer also to forced sterilization. It's a part of our history. It's a part of human rights human rights that we rarely forget. And then there is the issue of the ethos of civil society. Civil society, as I said, understood very broadly, meaning not only NGOs, not only United Nations agencies, it is us, people, performing the role of the agents of social change. So I was talking with Susie that I gained a lot of inspiration from disability activists who were active in 60s, 70s, 80s, when the movement was growing, because they were naming things as they were. They were not afraid to be called radical, but they are very onto the point, even when you think about today's realities. And you read, for example, Paul Hunt, Stigma, highly recommended, from 1966. His thinking actually gave rise to the UPAS and the social model of disability. That's the roots. And he himself was an institutionalized disabled person who said, we are society as much as anybody, and cannot be considered in isolation from it. Sounds radical. So pause. I just hope that all of us have more opportunities like this school to have a pause for critical reflection of dominant discourses and practices, including human rights. Let's not take them for granted. And please remind ourselves that we are not neutral objectives, agents of change, but we're also embedded within certain systems. We have our standpoints, biases, privileges, and we experience certain forms of discrimination. So we are, in a way, in our bubbles. So before we start to act, let us reconsider those bubbles, and let's listen to disabled women and girls and disabled people in general, but treat them as experts, as theorists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Magda. As a failed sociologist, I really have to pay tribute to you for reminding me that I did enjoy sociology when I did it, but I think it's so good that we have reflection, emancipatory research regarding people as theorists, and thinking about why we are where we are, which is all really important when you bring that together with, I suppose many of the people here have, perspectives in law and human rights law, but also that sociology and the research and talking to people and listening to them and regarding their views and their reflection when we're all talking about, well, these things are wrong, how do we fix them, blah, 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 So I think that's really important, and thank you so much. So we have about 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes for reflections from the floor. So I have somebody at the back of the room. Do I have people with microphones?